All right. This video, very brief review of types of norms. So we're going to talk a little bit about mores, folkways, and taboos, sort of in terms of degrees of severity. And then we will talk about them a little bit in terms of function. So we will talk about prescriptive and proscriptive norms, and then we will do a very brief discussion of descriptive norms. Not necessarily, that one's not in your book. I'm just going to give it to you because it makes our conversations about real and ideal culture a little bit simpler. So if we start from the most serious norms in society, the ones that we sort of think about as being essential and really fundamental, we're starting with taboos. And taboos, the way that I usually explain it to people is that when we talk about taboos, these are often norms that you don't have to think about because the idea of following through on that is so far away from the experience of culture that we generally think about it as being a marker of significant illness. When we sort of talk about people who break taboos, they're often understood as evil. If you're sort of thinking about that. And an example of this might be something like cannibalism. So I doubt many of you have ever sort of seriously pursued the idea of like, hey, what does human flesh taste like? And most of the examples that you can think of, like you probably don't know anyone who's done that either, who sort of intentionally went, you know what, that's a great idea, let's do this. In fact, most of the time when I talk with students in class, their only real experience with cannibalism is Hannibal Lecter, from The Silence of the Lambs and or Hannibal, depending on sort of the era in which you consume that. So the conversation there, and like Hannibal Lecter is understood as a character who is, terrifying and evil and is locked inside like crazy containment like significant containment pieces to try to protect society from him because he's understood as evil and dangerous in some really important ways. So people who break taboos are sort of in that category. These are really, really, really serious norms, often of the kind that you would never think to express to someone because you just take it for granted that this is the way that the world works. Like we don't eat other people. Okay, good. And then we sort of carry on. Mores are a little bit different in that mores are things that we consider serious in society. They're important, but we at the very least have like an understanding that runs in the back of sort of a societal a societal set of ideas that people may wish to do them anyway. So, for example, most of you probably don't have a clear idea of why would you wish to consume another human being. Like you probably don't think that. Other examples of taboos, like you don't think about why would you want to have a sexual relationship with your sibling or your parents. Like you just, that's a really hard thing to wrap your head around. We can do that. There's a whole bunch of conversations about power, especially in French sociology, but not for this class. When we start talking about that piece, but you probably do have an idea, of like how you might justify something like, why would someone wish to cheat on their spouse? Why would someone wish to misreport numbers on their taxes? Why would someone wish to drive faster than the posted speed limit? Why would someone wish to copy answers on a test from someone else? Okay? And these are rules that we have in society. We often codify these into law. Taboos are sort of codified into law too, but we don't usually deal with people who break them very often. Sort of like that's a thing, mostly for the weird extreme cases, for the extreme cases where we need to talk about it. But when we talk about that sort of conversation about mores, these are rules and norms, in terms of expectations of behavior that we expect people to follow, although we understand that they occasionally have motivations not to, and we usually codify them. And people who break mores, yes, and it is pronounced more. I know it looks like mores, but it's not. It's more. It comes out of the, I don't know what, I used to know whether that was Latin or Greek, and I don't right now, but that's okay. So mores, people who break mores are often thought of as bad, right? they have done something wrong and society might feel a need to punish them, whether that is formally with something like prison or a fine, or informally around like, oh, I'm just not going to hang out with that person because they are sort of a bad influence, whatever you sort of want to talk about in that sort of way. Does that make some sense? I hope so. When we talk about folkways, these are ways of behaving that are customary, but they are not understood as being quite so fixed in the same sort of way. So there are lots of examples that we could sort of talk about. One of my favorites is to talk about things like, what side of an escalator do you stand on and what side of an escalator do you walk on, right? That is a folkway. It's not like no one is going to put you in, like, to give you a fine for doing that wrong. That's not how this works. You're just sort of going to get maybe funny looks, maybe people being like, hey, maybe people sort of thinking that you're rude. So people who break folkways, these are sort of the least formalized of our norms, are often thought of as being maybe a little bit odd, maybe a little bit weird, but we don't necessarily feel the need to sort of strongly punish that or sort of codify what the punishments for that are. So that's the like piece of that. So another example of folkways might be, how do you dress to attend classes, which is a norm and a folkway that you guys have probably seen shift quite a lot over the last 18 months, because if you were going to go to school physically, right? If you're going to get out of your house and get on the bus or drive to an actual physical building to go to school, you would never go to class you would likely never go to class in your pajamas. Except if you're doing all of your schooling from home and online, I imagine you know lots of your classmates and even yourself who might have done their classes in pajamas and or sweatpants for the better part of the last 18 months. So we can sort of see folkways shifting a little bit, and that's also important to know about folkways, is because they are the least formalized, they're also the norms that can shift the fastest. Again, a friend who's a kindergarten teacher was talking about her use of the word bussin' in my language video, if you saw that one. But she will also talk about how this is one of those things that makes her feel really, really old, in that if someone asked her, going through sort of her elementary school years and even sort of now, to make a phone with her hand, she would do this. Right? See this gesture? Like this. Awesome. If you ask her 5-year-old students to do that, they do this. They take their hand and it's flat, right? Because when she was growing up, phones had receivers. And they stretched in that sort of way, and they had that curve shape to them. Whereas her students mostly experience their smartphone, which is flat. So that sort of thing changes very, very quickly. Okay. I want to talk about prescriptive and proscriptive norms sort of briefly here. Prescriptive is to prescribe, as in the norms that tell you what you're supposed to do. So you might talk about the norms of, well, you're supposed to eat 7 servings of vegetables a day and get at least 30 minutes of physical activity, right? Prescriptive norm. Proscriptive norms are norms that prohibit, right? Norms that stop you from doing something. So you are not supposed to smoke or take illegal drugs. You're not supposed to stay up till 5 a.m. binge watching Netflix, any number of those things, okay? And then we have descriptive norms, which your book doesn't talk about, but I'm going to sort of give it to you because it's really helpful when we talk about real and ideal cultures. And descriptive norms aren't about what anyone should or shouldn't do. They're the idea of norms identifying what people actually do, right? So if we think about, say, a speed limit sign, and I'm in Edmonton, and I imagine most of you have some experience living in the area, so I will give this example, but it's not super, super local when you talk about that. But speed limit signs are an example of a partially prescriptive norm, as in you should be driving about this fast, and partially a proscriptive norm indicating you should not be driving any faster than this. However, there are any number of roads in the city where the descriptive norm, as in how fast people actually drive on that road on a regular basis, are different from the posted speed limits. My experience for this has usually been on parts of the Whitemud and parts of the Henday, in that the speed limit is posted at 80 or 100 depending, but you routinely see traffic across the whole road. So it's not one person who's breaking the norm, it's that the descriptive norm, what people actually do in any given time, at any given point in time, is, for example, 110 kilometers, 90 kilometers, easily 10 to 15 kilometers over the posted speed limit. Right? So we have those sorts of norms that sort of fit in that place. And I brought that up because when we talk about real culture and ideal culture is the prescriptive norms. It's the things we are supposed to value and want and do. And real culture is the descriptive norms, as in how people actually enact those and what sacrifices they are willing to make when we do that. So that idea about real and ideal culture and the potential for there to be differences between them is not just a case when we talk about cultural values. It exists for pretty much all of our norms, right? I gave some examples of prescriptive and proscriptive health norms, and then we can talk about, descriptive norms and how many hours of television most Canadians watch. We'll get to that in our media unit too, in terms of what people actually eat, how much they actually exercise, all of that sort of stuff in terms of what people actually do, regardless of what they should or should not do. And I hope that that helps you understand something in that sort of space of real and ideal culture, because that is useful to understand for most other norms in our society. So for example, right, we have proscriptive norms that tell you you're not allowed to jaywalk. And yet, there are probably many environments that you occupy where there are a lot of people who jaywalk anyway. If you live on a 6-lane street, probably less of it. But if you live on sort of a really very quiet residential street, there are probably lots of people who do not go all the way to the corner to cross the street. And that's sort of a descriptive norm that sort of is another way of looking at the expressions of real culture.